a lot of things consistent across cycle 1 and 2 to ensure comparability. They also had to make a couple different changes to try to improve like the reach of their sampling procedure. There are also other things where they've like changed uh, kind of how they're like these range from pretty big changes to like how they look at problem solving to like changes to just like question wording because a question was like kind of confusing in cycle 1 and they wanted to like ensure that they got kind of more got the right responses. Um, we've touched on some of these different changes across cycle 1 and 2 in previous webinars. As a kind of a quick refresher, some of the stuff we discussed last webinar included the way that the cycles kind of treat low-skilled adults. In both cycles, the assessment starts with a locator test, which kind of coarsely gauges their skill level. If they fail or get a very, very low score on this locator test, they're placed in a foundational skills assessment instead of taking like the full PIAC. In cycle 1, this foundational skills assessment focused on kind of just basic reading ability. In cycle 2, this was expanded to include also as kind of basic numeracy skills. In cycle 1, the components or foundational skills assessment wasn't used to calculate proficiency score, literacy proficiency score for low skilled adults. In cycle 2, the foundational skills assessment was used. So this means that cycle 1 and 2 are calculating the proficiency of low skilled adults differently. The proportion of these people is like small enough that it doesn't affect kind of population level comparisons. But if you're doing any sort of comparison between demographic groups across cycle 1 and 2 with a very high proportion of this population, it will actually affect it. So you should be looking at whether uh, like look at the cycle 2 locator test variable and see if more than 20% of your demographic group has failed that locator sample, the results are not comparable across cycle 1 and 2. Another important difference is that cycle 1 and cycle 2 are estimating replicate weights differently in Canada. In cycle 1, it's using Jackknife 1, and in cycle 2, replication weights are estimated using phase method. This won't impact cross-sectional analysis, but it will impact pooled analysis because the standard deviations are being estimated differently. And then there's kind of a number of different differences that we talked about resulting from kind of sampling procedure or just changes to their decisions of who to sample. Cycle 2 has a smaller sample overall. It also has less oversampling of underrepresented groups, which is something that they really try to do in cycle 1. And it's also kind of systematically missing like entire portions of the country. For instance, the territories were not sampled in cycle 2, but are present in cycle 1. So these are all things to kind of keep in mind. And if you want, you can also rewatch previous webinars as a refresher. Um, another kind of another important difference to keep in mind is just that the variables themselves have changed in a lot of cases or might be slightly different. Next slide. One way to think of this is to kind of use OECD's framework for cycle comparability, which has some sort of a spectrum from completely new to cycle 2 and not comparable to basically the same. Things that are new to cycle 2 include the adaptive problem solving assessment. It's just they're looking at problem solving in a very different way. And also they've added new numeracy and literacy items to try to get at things that weren't on they didn't assess in cycle 1. For instance, literacy in cycle 2 also includes items that are focused more on kind of critical evaluation of information and evaluating sources. This doesn't like the items from cycle 1 are still in cycle 2, but there's also just like there's new items that don't have an analog in cycle 1. Portions of the background questionnaire are also new to cycle 2. For instance, it includes a short Big Five inventory to measure social emotional skills, which is very different than how social emotional skills were looked at previously. And then it gets a bit more gray when you get to variables where it's kind of present in both, but has been adapted in a way that probably makes it non-comparable or means that you might have to like kind of be careful about sort of which variable you're picking to compare across. So for instance, cycle 1 uses ISCDED coding scheme to code like education and things like that. In cycle 2, they're using the 2011 coding scheme, but they do, I believe, and actually correct me if I'm wrong, I think cycle 2 still does have some variables that like then code it back based on the 1997 coding scheme. So there is still a variable in cycle 2, but if you just look at like the first education variable, you find like you have to like basically take into account like what coding scheme is being that cycle two has variables that have different coding schemes for the same kind of information. There's others where, for instance, total time spent on training in cycle one, this question is asking total time spent on training kind of in the past year. In cycle two, yeah, and there are crosswalks between the ISCD criteria. Thank you, Ashley. Um, in cycle two, they found that that question was like very confusing and led to like very different kind of like very complex data. So they changed this to say, what is the total time you spent on your last training activity? So it might look like total time spent on training is the same across, but this is one where you actually look at when the way that they changed the question has changed what the data will be, or like how has made it not comparable across cycles. And then there's ones where it's probably comparable. It's probably safe, but there's enough changes that it's something that you should at least keep in mind. Like these are small changes to wording or kind of the prompt that's used. It probably shouldn't affect comparability, but it's something just to keep in mind in case you do have like a strange result or an unexpected result. These include just, for instance, like the activities last year question, they just like changed the prompt to be a bit clearer in some cases. And then variables that are basically the same in both cycles. This include things like the most literacy and numeracy items, as well as a, a large portion of the background questionnaire, including things like whether they're taking the test in their home language and stuff like that. So this is something where it's probably good to, if you're comparing cycle one and two data, to think about where your key variables fall on this spectrum. That is actually a pretty challenging task, but there is something that actually can make it quite easy, which is uh, the Shiny app PIAC variable finder, which lets you very quickly search for PIAC variables in both cycle one and two data, and will tell you whether this variable is only in cycle one, only in cycle two, or even or whether it trends across. It doesn't just tell you whether it's kind of in both, it tells you whether it's like a directly comparable, like basically the same, or if it's changed in some way, it'll tell you how it's changed, or if it's kind of softly trending. I can actually do we want to do like a quick web example of that? Actually, and I think it's just being able to like search through PF variables like this so quickly is very helpful. So it has a couple options in your search. If you click this, it'll only show variables that trend across cycle one and two, either strictly trending or like at least some kind of associate. If you click this, it'll only show variables that are not missing in the public use file. However, it shows this if it's not missing in at least one public use file. So it might still be missing in the Canadian public use file because the Canadian public use file has a lot of extra kind of missing variables. But so for example, let's say you want to see the training, or sorry, search total time spent on training. Um, and I'll say this is in cycle one. It'll say the trend status is soft because the total time spent on training was changed. One thing, the PIAC variable finder, it uses soft to refer to both kind of adapted and the like soft trending to cycle two. So that includes both ones where it's just been small changes and ones where it is kind of a different variable. So yeah, the measurement of total time spent on training was changed, asking only for the numbers of hours spent on last training activity. So it's done after the pretest results indicate this measure resulted in mostly the same kind of answers as the more complex set of questions. And then it'll also help like tell you what the kind of trending or like this would be the variable in cycle two that you could compare it to. So that's really helpful is kind of telling you because they're not coded, like the variable codes are not the same necessarily across cycles. So this will give you the corresponding variable name across cycles. Maybe you should share, Ashley, or
No, just that it has a lot of capability and we find it really helpful. It's
Mhm.
really quick for seeing even just like the question wording and responses. So definitely use it if you're still sort of exploring the variables within both cycles.
Absolutely. Um, okay, next slide. Um, and then just some other considerations or things to keep in mind for cycle one and two comparisons. Uh, the doorstop interview in cycle two. if respondents were unable to complete the background questionnaire, for instance, due to like language barriers or like literacy difficulties, they instead completed a very short, what was called the doorstop interview. It had just a couple of questions and was meant to basically keep people who would have been filtered out in cycle one because of their like language difficulties in the data. So this helped reduce kind of systematic non-response in cycle two. It got people who in cycle one were kind of like yeah, like non-respondents. But it also does mean that the sample composition between cycle one and two was further changed because it's incorporating people who weren't necessarily captured in the first cycle. Um, and this is something that we've also talked about before about like whether to include doorstop participants in for other reasons because they didn't actually complete all of the questions and stuff like that. Relatedly, cycle two, again, to try to reduce non-response due to language barriers, also allowed the option of support from a translator. This is marked in the data set with variable ZZ1, BO2. This is just something to keep in mind, maybe if you're doing any sort of kind of demographic comparisons for groups that where there might be a high rate of like of potential language barriers or difficulties, that like some of the responses might have been supported by a translator, whereas in cycle one that wasn't an option. And then kind of related to all of these differences is the way OECD reports adjusted and unadjusted cycle two results because there are all these sort of sources of kind of sampling difference between the two cycles. When the OECD is reporting differences across cycle one or two or trends across them, they report both the unadjusted differences, which is just kind of the average within cycle two and the average within the cycle one population, and the adjusted differences, which are a reweighting of cycle two that tries to basically approximate cycle one population's demographic profile to kind of understand like if the cycle one population completed cycle two, what would their data look like? Um, and that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to like compare your cycle one and two comparison to any sort of like publicly available like OECD analysis of patterns. So yeah, those are some things to keep in mind for cycle one and two comparisons more generally. And then I'll turn it over to Ashley, who will give you kind of more direct, concrete help with actually doing these comparisons.
Yeah, thanks, Shine. So Miss Ashley and I are going to talk now about running pooled analysis, and I'm going to quickly cover sort of one of the first considerations if you are taking cycle one and cycle two data and you're pooling it together. And this is cases where you would be looking at proficiency estimates in literacy and numeracy. And this is what's called the linking error. And so it took me a little while to wrap my head around it, but essentially that linking error must be included in any pooled analysis that includes proficiency estimates. And here it would just be literacy and numeracy since they do have the soft trend between cycle one and two. And in particular that they are intended to measure the same constructs, so literacy skills and numeracy skills. However, there is a level of uncertainty between these two cycles based on variation in both how the assessments were given. The cycle two was fully digital, and also the instrument design. So some of the questions, as Shane mentioned, actually differ between cycle one and two. So this kind of raises the question: is a score of 235 in cycle two equivalent to a score of 235 in cycle one? And in our pooled analysis, we would be looking at these assessment scores on a single reporting scale. So it would be measuring up on this. And so the linking error helps us identify this level of uncertainty between the cycles. And there's a quote here from the OECD in their initial report where they say, I'm just going to read it out because I think it's really helpful. So the difference between a score in the second cycle scale and the corresponding score in the first cycle scale is modeled as a construct. Well, the actual value of this construct is unknown. Its standard deviation can be estimated, and this is what's known as the linking error. They estimate this to be 3.27 for literacy and 2.95 for numeracy. So this needs to be incorporated in any analysis that would be looking at the difference in assessment scores between cycle two and one. There's an important caveat here though, and this is found buried in the data analysis manual. And there's, again, two quotes here that I think are really useful. And the first one, they write, the linking error should always be added to the standard errors of differences in average proficiency score between the first and second cycles of PIAC. So what I interpret this as is if you are comparing cycle 1 and cycle 2 literacy or numeracy needs, you need to incorporate this linking error. But then they have a second quote where they say the linking error does not apply to trends of any statistics which is homogeneous to a score point difference, such as gender age gaps and proficiency score. So if you're comparing gaps, say like the difference in literacy scores between by age in cycle 1 and cycle 2, you actually don't need this linking error. So it's because this gap is free from the linking error that it shouldn't be incorporated. So I want to highlight that as your first consideration for running pooled analysis. And you can actually, in the International Data Explorer, you can run this quick sort of pooled analysis where you're sort of comparing cycle 1 and 2 literacy or numeracy scores. So this is an example here. Sorry, the text is so small, but I've sort of used Canada. I've incorporated cycle 1 and cycle 2. I'm looking at the difference in literacy score among all adults. And then I can use in the later stage, this build report stage here, I can actually build a significance test where it shows is the difference significant in overall literacy scores between cycle 1 and 2. And here it automatically will incorporate the linking error. The nice thing actually about this tool is it incorporates a really nice table. So this is the table that you can export as well. So this can be done quite quickly in the Data Explorer. The one thing I should say that I am not a huge fan of is that this result here is actually going to be just a little bit different from what the OECD reports, because the OECD has removed our doorstep participants. And I find that subsetting or sort of manipulating the population or sort of sample is a little bit tricky to do in the online Explorer. So, which is why we often use Stata or R for running our pooled analysis. I'm going to pass it over to Masashi to talk first about running this in Stata.
Hi, everyone. So next slide. So for pooled data analysis with cycle 1 and cycle 2 data, it's important to check first whether there's a change in replicate weight type employed between 2 cycles to do appropriate standard error calculations. And as Shane pointed out already, in Canada, the replicate weight type changed from Jackknife 1 to balanced repeated replication with phase adjustment. So that means we need to make some adjustment in replicate weights before carrying out pooled data analysis. And the chapter 5 of PIAC data analysis manual outlines the steps needed to do so. And specifically, to get appropriate standard errors, the manual instructs us to adjust replicate weights according to the formula presented below and use Jackknife to variance calculations. And according to this formula, the replicate weights are adjusted based on the final sample weight and the variance factor for the given replication methods employed. And for Jackknife 1, the variance factor is the number of replicate weights minus 1 divided by the number of replicate weights. And DRL with phase adjustment, the variance factor is 1 divided by the number of replicate weights times 1 minus weights coefficient squared. And for the Canadian PIAC, number of replicate weight is 80, and the phase coefficient is 0.3. That's the next slide. And if you are a starter user, this replicate weight adjustment is quite straightforward thanks to the STAT community contributed program developed by OECD analysts that facilitates model estimation using complex data, survey data such as PIAC. And as we presented in the previous webinar, the LEPEST command facilitates model estimations. again, I'm saying its main purpose is calculate appropriate standard error for a given sampling design and the plausible value represented in proficiency scores. And for pool data analysis with different replicate weight types, by adding the JK2 option to the command, the LEPEST automatically carries out replicate weight adjustment and calculates the correct standard errors based on the information included in the PIAC dataset. And the general syntax for pooled data analysis looks like the one on the slide. So after the LEPEST, we specify PIAC and specify your estimation command in the estimation of estimate options, and then add the JK2 weight options. Next slide. To demonstrate the use, we made this simple example where we calculate the gender gap in literacy score, gender gap in change in literacy score from cycle 1 to cycle 2 using the difference in difference estimations. The model specifies literacy score as a dependent variable, and the score is regressed on gender dummy, the cycle dummy, and the interaction of the two dummies. And the coefficient on the interaction term capture the gender difference in change in mean literacy scores. And to run the estimation in Stata, we first append the public use dataset for 2 cycles, which is done in the first part of this start script. And we also drop observation representing those who did doorstep interviews in cycle 2 in this case, in this example. And after that, we issue the LEPEST command to estimate the model. And in LEPEST command, a variable PBLA comes with an @ sign because the literacy scores are plausible values. And then JK2 weights are added as an option to normalize the replicate weights. And next slide. And this is the estimation result. So estimation results are from this output, we find difference in change in literacy score from cycle 1 to cycle 2 is about 2 points. And standard error is 2.12. So the difference is not statistically significant in Canada. And that's about a simple demo for Stata. And now Ashley is going to discuss pooled data analysis for using R.
Thanks, Masashi. So what we found primarily is that pooled analysis is pretty straightforward in Stata. In R, I've actually found it to be a little bit more tricky, and I will walk through why. So I'm going to start with the EdSurvey package. And just as a reminder, which we chatted about in our last discussion session, this was created and is maintained by Paul Bailey at the American Institute for Research, as well as sort of a wider team, often people who have current or previous affiliation with AIR. And its purpose is to work with large-scale survey and assessment data, primarily those used by the National Center for Education and Statistics in the US. Initially, I would say that the R environment is really well suited for cross-sectional and pooled analysis. So here's an example of some code where I'm reading in each data cycle. And here I'm actually using EdSurvey, the read PIAC command, in order to read in each cycle as a separate data frame. This is actually called an EdSurvey data frame. So it's really simple. You're able to actually just use the read PIAC. You have the path where both the CSV file is located, as well as the International Codebook Excel file, which it uses to label variables. And then I'm just listing what the country is. The really nice part about EdSurvey is I actually don't even have to say what cycle it is. It automatically detects the plausible values in survey design, and it stores this as metadata in this EdSurvey data frame. So this R environment is really nice. You can read it in, you can have both active, you can draw different analysis using these EdSurvey data frames. So I find it really well suited for cross-sectional analysis. There's 2 options for manipulating data in EdSurvey, and this is where things become, as an analyst, I find it a little bit more clunky to work with. And so one is that you can, so say you want to remove from cycle 2 your doorstep participants, maybe you want a subset, maybe you want to create new variables. You can use a limited number of EdSurvey functions, or you can extract a data frame from this original EdSurvey data frame and then prepare it using any of your preferred R tools or base R for data manipulation. And then you use this EdSurvey command called rebind attributes to then list it back as this is our cycle 2 Canadian PIAC data and run your analysis. In early publication here in 2020, they kind of have what they call as their recommended workflow. So again, you would read this in as PIAC data. You can explore it using some of these different EdSurvey features. You can search for variables. But then when it comes time to clean and manipulate the data, you have these two different options. In EdSurvey, there's really only a few limited options. So I actually found it almost easier to extract it as a separate data frame, manipulate it, and then bring it back into the EdSurvey sort of universe and then run analysis here. I would say as a primary Stata user, I found this to be a bit more clunky than what I would typically do in Stata. So I just wanted to highlight that because it becomes important when we're looking at running pooled analysis. So going back to sort of our example, so I've read in these two EdSurvey data frames. I can do some small manipulation. So for cycle 2, I can use the subset EdSurvey command to remove our doorstep participants. And then I use a really simple command for creating a new EdSurvey data frame, which actually has pooled data. So I'm just saying, calling this data frame Canada both, and I'm saying it has cycle 2 and cycle 1. And the really interesting thing about EdSurvey is actually identifies these two cycles. So if I ask it to give me back information about this EdSurvey data frame, it says there's 2 elements. And so it's listed in these 2 elements, the cycles. And then you can see it actually has a lot more information, but you can see the number of rows and then for cycle 1 and the number of rows for cycle 2, so a little bit smaller because I've removed those doorstep interviews than what you would see in your sort of raw data. So now I have this single data frame. It has 2 elements in it. Because it has 2 elements, I can only use EdSurvey data commands which are appropriate for a 2-element data frame. And the only one is the gap command. So the gap command runs t-test. And so this is an example where I've basically replicated what I did in the International Data Explorer. So I say, show me the difference in literacy scores, use this data, include the linking error. When I use EdSurvey to try to run regression analysis, it will automatically take the first element in that combined data frame. And so it won't, in order to use the regression command in EdSurvey, you actually have to have a single element that has the same weight variable structures with cycle 1 and cycle 2 doesn't. So you can get really complicated and start to manipulate the EdSurvey data frame, listing as Masashi just did, where he listed our Jackknife 2 replication approach and so forth. But I find I would not want to do this in EdSurvey. I would rather just use the basic survey command. So where this kind of leaves me personally as an analyst is I find EdSurvey can be really useful for cross-sectional analysis. It can be really useful if you're planning just to run t-tests because the gap command has been updated specifically for cycle 2 PIAC. It is not going to be very useful for running linear regression with both pooled cycles unless you're creating a new EdSurvey data frame with sort of your user-written weighting commands included, which you would just use survey to do that and MI tools if you're using the literacy or numeracy components. So I am going to kind of end there for our pooled analysis, and discuss at the end. You can also ask further questions. Before we kind of get to the discussion session, I will pass it over to Ruben to talk a little bit about kind of where we're going as a group.
Hello, everyone. There will be an opportunity to provide your own observations on what Ashley, Masashi, and Shane have been talking through on Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 analysis, and of course to ask questions after this slide. But just before we turn off the recording and open up to that discussion, I wanted to also raise a couple of helpful points, I hope, and really seek some of your input on where we go with our support moving forward. As you know, FSC has engaged in a partnership with SRDC to provide support to the analytical teams, and we're at a point now where we've done 3 of these webinars. We've been providing quite a bit of support through email and other communications, and also through our website. And we want to really take stock of what's the best way to provide any further support. As you can imagine, these webinars are really helpful when we have issues that are in common between the analytical teams, that you have shared interests in getting solutions. But much of what you will do inevitably will become very individualized and specific to your work as you go forward. So we're trying to provide support across both types. And we do remain available for really any kind of support through October that is needed for doing analysis with the PIAC data sets. And the first port of call would always be our email, piac@srdc.org, with any kind of request. It's a very good triage for us to work out what is arising from multiple teams, and therefore potentially could be of use in a website update or in a webinar. We have continued to update the website to provide common resources. We really appreciate any resources that you come across that you think could be of use to other researchers. Please let us know. We're happy to put them up. The website is now updated in French in full, as well as in the English version that people have been accessing, and we continue to add useful resources as we come across them. I'm just going to briefly run through where we may go with these webinars, but we're really looking for your input today. We have had 3 now on what we think are topics that are of common interest, but we're not sure where those would need to go next to remain of common interest. But we would like to continue to be able to touch base. So a suggestion is that for the end of July webinar, we actually kind of break with format. We don't have a formal presentation, but we ask for teams who wish to drop in and share how things are going with their analysis. We, of course, are doing our own analyses on 2 different papers. We'd be happy to share where we've got to. If that could be of value, please share your views on that after. If there's actually a burning topic, something that you think we should be covering in a webinar format, also please share that. Common topics we think will come up as we get further into the summer. The FSC has provided some documentation called report guidelines, which you should all have. If you haven't, can make sure that you get the link, but with the requirements for what it would like by way of a final report at the end of October. And so we are going to consider having a session at the end of August to go through that, and to include somebody from the FSC to answer any questions you may have on, the level of flexibility there is with that format. They have a very specified set of sections that they would like to see with page limits, and they also have the allowance for having appendices and an annex with additional content. And it may be helpful to get some guidance as to what can be included in those, and maybe even what other kinds of publication might be relevant at the same time. But FSC has got a clear expectation for the kinds of reports it would like coming out of the work that it's been funding. In addition, we obviously have a research seminar coming up in person in October, and so we could have a webinar just in advance of that, 3 or 4 weeks in advance of that, to think about the presentation format. We're anticipating there will be just shy of 30 minutes, maybe 27 minutes for each of the presentations. And we could think about having a session to talk about what will be relevant for the audience, which will be ourselves, but also a number of other invited expertise, policymakers, stakeholders in the skills ecosystem. And when we've got a clearer picture of who will be attending, it will be helpful perhaps to talk through the best way to structure those presentations for October. So that's another option for the webinar. And then we will very shortly give you more information about the seminar itself. We've been working to secure a venue. We think we've got pretty close this week. So within the next few weeks, we should be able to, or FSC will be sending out a message around the exact venue, the approximate agenda, and the logistical concerns so that you can potentially book your travel and accommodation if you're going to be attending. So this is for the 21st and 22nd of October. I think it's already been announced. Full day on the 21st, and the current plan is a half day on the 22nd, so ending around 1, if that helps with your long-term planning. So yeah, we are working on these different fronts. We're certainly welcome to ask. You can ask us any questions. We may have answers. We may refer to FSC on some of the presentation and report guidelines, but we're also, of course, going to welcome any suggestions you have for how we can provide better support through the next few months. So we'll move on to the next slide and probably turn off the recording and allow for some discussion. You, first of all, could have questions for us or observations on doing pooled